Back now, the Pulse, looking at all things people, power, and politics. Glad you're with us. Joining us now to talk about the budget battle happening in Washington, Troy Mayor Ethan Baker, a Republican, but in a nonpartisan role as mayor of Troy. Here at this table, though, perhaps talking a little bit about what Republicans are doing now. And Democratic State Representative Noah Arbit, always good to see you both. Thanks for joining us here.
Thanks for having us.
First time we've had the two of them on together.
That's true.
We've had you on separately for a long time.
Good to see you too, man.
All right, let's go. Let's talk about this. We'll begin with you, Representative Arbit. You were impassioned the last time you were on the show about the Medicaid loss and that so many people could end up feeling. Have we settled in all the analyses out there on an exact number of people in Michigan that you believe as a state lawmaker would actually lose Medicaid here?
Well, the best estimates from the Citizens Research Council of Michigan is about 700,000 Michiganders, a disproportionate number of whom, unfortunately, are children, because we're talking about also cuts to the children's health insurance program. You know, I have rarely seen something in my time as in office or just my time on this earth, something that is so unrepentantly cruel as this bill. Not only is it unrepentantly cruel, but it's also just plain stupid. Because if you look at what the budgetary impact of this will be, it's going to explode the national debt. It's going to explode our deficit. And it's, in the end, that's going to result in higher interest rates and increased costs for Michiganders for so many other items, whether you're talking about housing prices or you're talking about car loans. All of that is going to be so much more expensive for a president and a party that campaigned on lowering costs to now put this forward as something that's going to help Michiganders when all it's doing is stashing cash in the pockets of billionaires and the ultra wealthy. This is a shame.
Mayor Ethan Baker is a conservative who worked actually and knows and knew, I should say, then President Reagan and his wife, Nancy Reagan. You knew them. And this, if Ronald Reagan were here today, what do you believe, in your own words, that he would think about this bill relative to the fiscal responsibility piece?
Well, yeah, all of us, we know very well not to talk about what Ronald Reagan would have thought or said. We've been trained very well not to do that, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. But, you know, it's a great question. First of all, it looks like today's Republican Party and the fiscal concerns and responsibilities have changed dramatically compared to when President Reagan was president, right? There's definitely trillions of dollars being added to the debt over 10 years or projected to be added, although the president would have loved the supply-side tax cuts. I mean, those tax cuts were quintessential Reaganomics, right? So I think he would have loved that aspect of it. I don't know how much he would have really appreciated the potential cuts to children's health care and the SNAP benefits, for example. That he had a very sensitive spot in his heart for children, of course, but also those in need based on how he was raised in the Midwest.
It's fascinating because you look at just our state of Michigan and the history. I was talking to Governor Whitmer at Mackinac, and she was mentioning how she actually got the baton from then Governor Rick Snyder, who, by the way, worked in 2013 to expand Medicaid eligibility in the state of Michigan.
They did it together.
A Republican who worked with a Democrat to make this happen. When you see, Representative Arbit, someone like Governor Rick Snyder, who was the one tough nerd who looked at numbers and said, hey, we got to look at the heart, too. What do you think will happen with this bill moving forward? Are there enough Republicans who are like the Rick Snyders of our country to say, wait a minute, we can't let this happen?
It doesn't appear that way.
For Republicans.
It doesn't appear that way. And I think, you know, you have seen that this Republican conference in Congress really just sort of, you know, look at Donald Trump and say, you know, he says jump and they say how high. I mean, the Republican Party, unfortunately, has become a cult to Donald Trump. And so I don't believe that. I mean, that's why we've seen the Senate vote for it. I mean, there were 3 senators who voted, you know, no, but I think there are a lot more Republican senators who didn't want to vote for it and knew that this was bad, but didn't believe that they could cross the president because that would be crossing their base. And so many Republican voters, unfortunately, these days, you know, take the president's word as gospel. And you know what the president is trying to do with this bill, what the Republicans are trying to do with this bill, ripping away health care for millions of Americans in order to pay for tax cuts to billionaires and the ultra wealthy. We will not recover from this for a generation.
And Representative Arbit, I do want to talk about the tax cuts for a moment, because one thing that I think is being marginalized, at least in mainstream, is the fact that the 2017 tax cuts that would be put back into effect would not just benefit billionaires. In fact, it would benefit the middle class and low income folks as well.
That's not true.
Why do you say that?
That's not true.
Why do you think that?
Because actually, if you look at the 10% poorest Americans, working class Americans, are actually going to see a maximum of 4% increase in taxes. They're going to see a 4% reduction in their annual income because of the tax cuts. They don't extend to the lowest 10%. That bracket, the lowest bracket,
I totally
is
understand
increased.
what you're saying. But Mayor Baker, when you look at
increased child tax credits are going to affect everybody.
up by $2,000,
which is a huge amount. I have 3 kids. That makes a huge difference, and I'm not the only one that's going to affect. You know that the seniors are getting their increased tax benefits. Trump couldn't get in his no tax on Social Security income, but he is giving that, I think it's $6,000 tax deduction to seniors of a certain income level, which will greatly affect many, many seniors. I think the tax cuts, what we're facing, those tax cuts were in the sunset at the end of this year,
right,
and result in a $4.5 trillion tax increase. The economy couldn't withstand that right now. So those tax cuts are the reason the
cut spending.
And
I don't.
These are Democratic talking points. I'm sorry. The Democrats have never cut spending when they've had the chance. I'm sorry.
Democrats aren't in control.
Well, when
Democrats
they were,
aren't in
they
control.
didn't do it either.
But you know,
and the Republican talking point is, well, we can't afford this, we can't afford this, and yet suddenly we can afford tax cuts to billionaires, stashing money in the pockets of billionaires
at
the
expense
correctly.
I think that's framed wrong.
At the expense of healthcare and food assistance.
Okay, why do you think that that's framed wrong?
I do think it's framed wrong because Republican orthodoxy, whether you agree with it or not, is that tax cuts are not spending cuts that affect the economy.
But these tax cuts aren't fully paid for.
Right?
These tax cuts aren't fully paid for. They will add to the debt. You know it. You said it.
If we're going to cut taxes, we should cut equal spending.
I agree.
It's preposterous that we don't even talk about deficits anymore. The people talking about deficits are the Democratic state representative from Michigan, right? That is unheard of in this country.
Because I believe in fiscal rectitude.
And by the way,
Republicans won races for decades by talking about fiscal responsibility and reducing deficits. And that apparently doesn't matter anymore.
I believe we have.
We should mention, Representative Arbit, that it was also President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris when she ran for office that didn't talk at all about fiscal responsibility, but instead, during the Democratic regime, actually added to the deficit, and so they're both responsible.
Every president has added since Clinton, right? Since Clinton, who cut the deficit and cut the debt, right?
Because of the tech boom, he got lucky with that. That was a big thing.
I want to talk about what's next year. So they're looking for 4 Republicans, at least some are, to say no, right? So say nay. Competitive districts out there. Let's talk about the political calculus in our quick minute and a half that we have left here. How important is it for these lawmakers to look at where they're going home to and what they have to tell their constituents?
I think this bill is going to pass. Senator Murkowski from Alaska voted for it. I think it's going to pass the House. And there's a good argument to be made whether or not the Democrats want to admit it, that 7 out of 10 people want people who are on Medicaid to be looking for work or getting better education. That's something that polls very well in districts when properly asked, as well as 6 out of 10 people think there needs to be a better focus on cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. Whether that goes too far with this bill, that's a legitimate
I don't think they cut waste, fraud, and abuse at all. I think the biggest waste, fraud, and abuse is giving tax
back in the district
to billionaires.
What about the work requirements?
If the stories are told right back in the district
That's the cuts.
then it's going to make a difference.
But what about people out there who may, not the children, not the moms, but the people who are able-bodied, who are literally getting money and not doing the work, the charitable work or the educational work that they're now going to be required to do? Do you believe they should be able to go and get the benefits without doing the work?
They have tried work requirements in Arkansas. It was a complete failure. It did not result in increased employment.
Is there a way to do it, though?
Not that I know of. And I will just say this, and I want to actually speak directly to the viewers, because if you, after this bill passes, if you are someone who is having trouble accessing Medicaid, your health insurance, or food assistance, contact your state representative, because we will help you make sure that you have the assistance that you need. And if your state representative isn't going to help you, you can contact me, because I'll move heaven and earth to make sure that you get the assistance
Mayor Baker,
you deserve.
you sit in a city right now, as we know, the Lighthouse and other places that provide assistance to people. They don't just go to people who are poor. There are people who are struggling in all communities, including Troy. Are you concerned about the SNAP benefits?
Absolutely. I'm part of the Mayor's Alliance for Preventing Children Hunger. I worry very much about that. I'm a child who grew up with a single mom on welfare and food stamps. I understand deeply how important those benefits can be. Do I think there's problems with them on occasion? Yes. Do I appreciate that someone needs to always be looking at how to make the program better? Yes. But I do worry about kids. It's summertime. We know a lot of kids don't eat in the summer unless they're in school. So I worry about it very much.
The craziest thing about the SNAP cuts, in particular the way the Senate passed the bill, is that they actually did not cut SNAP for the states that had the highest error rate, so the highest waste, fraud, and abuse in terms of allocating SNAP benefits. Those are the states that didn't get cut, and the only reason why, they needed Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski's vote, and that was the only way to carve out Alaska.
And by the way,
it's a shameful way to legislate.
Murkowski did work very hard after her 2 decades of service, worked really hard to make some amendments to the bill, and without those amendments, she wouldn't accept the bill as it was. And that's the work that's going to be done at the House moving forward. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, or if you support Trump or you don't. It's really important to remember the human impact of all of this and to look at it honestly. And that's what this mayor has done, who's a Republican, and this state rep is doing here as a Democrat. And we thank you both for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Always good to see you
Very
both
important issue.
together on the Pulse. Wonderful. Wow, a civil conversation, yet they can disagree. Amazing, right? We're opening the Pulse mailbox after the break. What some of you had to say about our show recently, and it's not all good. Yeah, you want to stick around for that. You're watching the Pulse.